Thank you. Sarah Rouse from Children in Crisis. I think the whole panel discussion has been fascinating. Rakesh, this is specifically for you in relation to schooling inputs versus the outputs. My experience coming from working for an organisation that focuses wholly on conflict-affected and post-conflict countries, where I appreciate the investment and financing in education might not have increased, but where I still see that there is an absolute need for schooling inputs. There needs to be better infrastructure, there needs to be qualified teachers, there needs to be books and materials. I'm not seeing any of that translated on the ground. So either I've missed your point, Rakesh, or I'm not quite getting whether you're saying that the investments in other countries in schooling inputs are being realised on the ground but aren't realising outcomes, or whether actually that investment is going somewhere else.
Thanks very much. And one right here.
Hello, I'm Rachel Hinton from DFID. That was a very stimulating session, thank you. And I think it's no surprise there that in both of the case studies we heard, the teacher professionalism was a key factor. And I was very interested to know in Chile a bit more about the costing of doing that and the initiatives that you took in Chile to professionalise teachers, and in particular the difference between the incentive systems that were used. We heard there that one is much more individual and the other is school-based, and whether there's something there that perhaps relates to Rakesh's points around leadership and the political dynamics, and the extent also as to whether it's actually about raising the status, that these bonuses are about raising the status, or whether actually you feel it was something to do with the financial, the money itself.
Thank you. One right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Max Walter. I'm a student at the LSE. I'd like to direct my question to both of the country speakers in the room. I thought in the paper, and also from Rakesh's points, the paper on the political drivers of education progress, there were some very interesting points, particularly on the demand side of the political considerations. And I would like to ask the two country speakers to comment a bit more on what you found in Chile and in Indonesia on the demand side of how political demand for education shapes education progress. I mean, you have your own ideas about this, but I'd be particularly interested in Chile on whether you're concerned by the growth of private schooling and whether that undermines the political support for public sector education.
Thank you. Okay, if we could leave it there.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going quickly around the room. Anywhere here?
John Martin, Cambridge Education. I just wanted to ask Daniel a couple of questions. I was very interested in what he said about teacher professionalisation. Obviously, better conditions, more development, but it was the evaluation of teachers' performance that particularly interests me. So I'd like to ask how that actually takes place, and how that is actually then linked back to incentives in terms of promotion, pay, salary, and finally, whether that promotion itself is actually linked to change in job roles, more responsibility and accountability.
Can I get a sense of how many questions are over on this side? Just one. Okay, so one. Okay, can we do one right here in the centre first, and then.
Judith Emery, British Council. I was very interested in the point about looking at learning outcomes rather than simply the inputs. And the question I have is, to what extent, where teacher professionalism has been looked at, are we talking about teacher knowledge, or are we talking about teaching methodology, about pedagogy?
Thank you. And Susan, one last quick question from you, or comment.
very much. Susan Durston, ex-UNICEF. I'd like to know from any of the countries if they have any ongoing systems in terms of how to monitor emerging inequities, either related to introduction of technology or children who are getting left behind through structural reforms, because I've observed them on the ground in some countries I'm working in at the moment. And I think that kind of a lobby needs to come from a country that is able to listen to uncomfortable realities rather than from the global community that is constantly pushing this inequity issue.
Thanks, Susan.
I'll keep the others.
Thank you. Actually, there'll be an opportunity to discuss these issues over lunch as well. Actually, not for Rakesh, but for the rest of us. So, look, I'm going to try and just divide these up a little bit. So, Rakesh, could you? There was, I think, a couple of questions that relate directly to your point about inputs and learning, and just to sort of clarify that distinction. I mean, I think you weren't saying that inputs aren't significant, but that maybe we've been focusing too much on the input side and not enough on the learning outcome side.
Yeah, so I mean, I think 2 points about inputs. One is that, of course, inputs matter, but they matter instrumentally. I think we get into trouble when inputs become an end in themselves and we start measuring progress in terms of inputs, which is generally how we've measured progress in education. But the other is that there are some other things that matter alongside inputs as well, such as incentives, such as accountability, such as teacher motivation. In a lot of it, again, as has been mentioned, is not so much about coming up with a menu of the 7 things that matter, but rather how do they get strung together in a system with leadership that delivers and brings the key actors together to get things done. So I think that anybody can come up with a list of what matters, and there's plenty of handbooks and manuals out there of a good school should have these 5 features. The key question is not that. The key question is how do these things come together, pull people together to deliver them and get sustained over time.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. Daniel, could I ask, there were actually quite a lot of questions for you, but maybe just to try and focus it on 2. One on this issue of teacher professionalism in Chile. But secondly, also, I did want you to address this issue that Rakesh raised also, which is on private schools. And, whether they're a sort of source of inequality, driving source of inequality, or whether potentially they could address some of the issues that we're concerned about with respect to access and equity. All in 4 minutes. I should
all in 4 minutes, yeah. Pero solo en 4 minutos. 2 minutes for teacher, 2 minutes for private sector. Okay. La evaluación docente fue acordada con el sindicato y se votó en 2004 y ganó con un pequeño margen la idea de hacer una evaluación docente.
So the teacher evaluation was agreed with the unions and was voted in 2004. So since then, basically, the evaluations have been occurring.
Es una evaluación que combina conocimiento disciplinario docente a través de un test con conocimiento de pedagogía, con conocimiento de cómo hacer clases.
So that's something that combines 2 aspects of teaching, one of which is the knowledge-based side of a teacher, the professionalism in that sense, as to what the knowledge of that teacher is, and then the second was how to implement and how to actually teach.
A través de básicamente a través de observación de clase.
Basically through class observation.
Tiene un impacto en incentivos que es un poco indirecto, en el sentido que los que están bien evaluados pueden aplicar a un programa especial que impacta en incentivos, pero ellos deben estar bien evaluados para aplicar a otro programa que les pone incentivos salariales.
It works in a slightly indirect way in that those who have had a good evaluation can apply to get into a system of higher incentives, including salary hikes and so forth. But they have to have a good evaluation before they are permitted to actually make that application.
Pero sí tiene efectos en el sentido de los que están mal evaluados por 3 ocasiones consecutivas no pueden seguir haciendo docencia.
And another impact or another result of these evaluations are that those who've received 3 consecutive bad evaluations or low evaluations are no longer allowed to teach.
Los docentes mal evaluados tienen un programa especial de apoyo para prepararlos a la siguiente evaluación.
Those who have been badly evaluated or evaluated as not good have a special program which they can go into in order to help to prepare them for the following evaluation.
La data sobre impacto en mejora general del sistema es un poco confusa.
The data according to the sort of general improvement in the system is a little bit confused.
Pero hay una relación, hay una correlación relativamente consistente entre docentes bien evaluados y escuelas con mejor promedio en el test.
But there does seem to be a correlation between schools which have teachers who have done well in their evaluations and
average in test. Average in test.
And who also have good test results. The schools themselves have good test results. There seems to be a correlation between those 2 factors.
Este sistema solo se aplica a los profesores del sector público y no se aplica a los profesores del sector privado.
This system is only applied to those in the public sector and not to teachers in the private sector.
Esa es una de mis preocupaciones importantes con los docentes del sector privado. Más de la mitad de la matrícula está en el sector privado y no sabemos cómo lo hacen sus docentes.
This is one of my major worries, my major preoccupations with teachers in the private sector. Over 50% of our kids are in private education and we don't know how their teachers are teaching them.
Probablemente hay un vínculo importante entre este arreglo institucional de privados subsidiados con inequidad. Es lo más
There
probable.
is probably a strong link between inequity and this system of non-evaluated private education.
Okay. Actually, could I thank you so much for that. Joe, I was going to ask you something specifically on Indonesia, but you've just finished a review looking at the role of private schools actually, and I wonder, just maybe in brief summary form, what are some of the key findings from that?
We've actually just completed a kind of a broader review on non-state schooling, but it's the review of private schooling, which we did for DFID, was completed a year ago. We actually were lucky enough we have the lead author here as well. Dr. Laura Dash is over in the back there as well. It's worth saying that review focused mainly on DFID priority countries, and so we didn't cover a lot of the evidence from Latin America. But there, I think the overall finding really was that there was a real dearth of evidence and a real dearth of kind of rigorous quantitative comparisons between the state and private sector. The evidence was relatively concentrated in South Asia, and there's relatively little around kind of the broader impact of the private sector on the state education system, and so this is still kind of an area which needs a lot more research to be developed on.
Okay, thank you for that. Chris, you've got the really short straw in all of this on many counts, which is one, we've had a series of very detailed, great presentations, and you also stand between the audience and lunch, so you really... But let me pass over to you, because I mean, just maybe take 10 minutes or so just to give us your reflections on the day.
Yeah, thanks. So Kevin's right on all counts, and he's chaired valiantly as well. We had 4 things from Kevin that he thought we should be thinking about. We had 5 from Nick. We had 5 from Rakesh. So I'm not going to try and enumerate another 4 or 5, but there are 3 things I just want to focus on. So a bit less, for your lunch kind of incentives there. The first thing is about positive messaging, actually. So just where Susan started this whole conversation today, which I've really enjoyed this, it was about that, was trying to get some positive messaging out there. I came back from Ethiopia a year ago, where I've been the senior education advisor for DFID for 6 years. And that is positive messaging, seriously, on education. I mean, it's been referenced in some of these case studies. And I was a bit surprised when I came back to realise, actually, this isn't... There's a bit of a negativity around some of what's happening in the education space. And there are 2 aspects to it, I think. One is around education's place in development, and I think Kevin touched on that. Where do we sit with growth? How do we make those arguments? I think possibly we talk to each other a bit too much. So we're often education people talking to education people, so we need to get out of that box a bit more. So that's something I think is going to be important. The other thing is about our effort in education, Rakesh's point and a number of other points. So one way you could read the narrative, and I spoke to Pauline about this from the GMR last year, is look, we've really invested in education since the MDGs. We've spent a lot of money on it, and we've done really well. We've got this very, very big increase in enrolment. But hang on a minute, nobody's learning anything. 250 million kids not achieving the basics. That's the headline message from the GMR. That's not a great thing for us to take back to policymakers in DFID and say, oh, look, this is a good bet. It's a good bet, guys. Look, so what is our narrative? Is it that look, we knew this would happen. We had to build the systems. Now we've got the platform. We can move forward. Or is it that, actually, we didn't quite get it right, but we know now what we need to do, and we're going to take corrective action? But I do think, whatever it is, this messaging, we do need to be clear what we're saying and what is our set of arguments, which is some of the things that we've touched on today and that the case studies are helping us with. Second thing, I think, linked to this is the politics, but I'm kind of coming at it more from a global political perspective. What we're seeing is aid to education falling. Is that because of this story? Can we not make the case? Is it, GPE just had its replenishment, 2.1 billion. In one sense, that's a really good story, but actually they were trying to go for 3.5 billion. So it didn't quite make it. Is there an issue around our global instruments? Have we got that right? Are these good investments? Lisbeth said yesterday, we can't get a Bill Gates interested in big private investments in education, because when we look at the evidence, it's hard to see. It's really hard. This stuff is difficult. It's not easy to see the link between the financing and the outcomes. So how do we kind of get that story right? And that brings me to the last point, which is the evidence point. And I just want to flag the systems research in DFID, and it'll be discussed this afternoon. DFID certainly thinks evidence really does matter. We blogged on this, Laura Savage, who's here, and where's Laura? Just put your hand up. Blogged on this in advance of this event, so it's worth having a look at that. I haven't talked to any of that now. Why we think that matters and how we think that's going to move forward. I don't think we do know all the answers here, and I think large-scale systems research with sound methodology, and that's going to be really trickier, is going to be really important, and we are investing in that, and we want others to get behind that, and the research community and the policymakers also to get behind that. And the other bit of that is we've got a whole team in DFID called we have all kinds of things, but evidence into action, right? But I think that's a recognition of the difficulty of getting this stuff, getting traction on evidence in policy making. And if you think about it, I'm responsible for all of DFID's advisors. We've got about 44 advisors, right? And many of them work in country. And we're getting into really difficult stuff now. We're not talking about financing for education with governments. We're talking about how do you allocate the financing. We're not talking about, well, you need to put more, you need to invest more in teacher training. We're saying, no, you need to invest in teacher training in a different way. We're talking to them, we want to talk to them about curriculum. Incredible. I mean, this stuff is political, it's very difficult. So we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of doing this either, and that this isn't going to, we're not going to get a quick fix. And I think some people, and maybe, sometimes ministers, that's what they want, but we also need to get the message out that this isn't going to be quick, it's going to be a long-term process, and we need time, but we do know what we're doing. Thanks.
Great. Actually, that was very impressive. That was 8 minutes. You finished 2 minutes ahead of time. You probably heard the stomachs rumbling behind you. Look, I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody. I think it's been a great day and a really good discussion. And I think ending on the note and the challenge that Chris gave us, that this is a real moment to think about the messaging and how we communicate these issues. Because I think we've got a bit of a tendency in education to be defeatist and a bit miserable, and it's sort of speaking to each other too much. But I think this question that, I often make this point that, you go to any slum in Africa and you see this extraordinary passion and commitment and drive to get children an education because people believe in it. It's about building a better future. And I think somehow we have to capture that and bottle it and bring it to these wider discussions. And I very much like Rakesh's point as well, that you can come up with good ideas until the cows come home. But if you can't build a coalition for change that makes a difference, it doesn't have the impacts that we want. And also, Chris's challenge on what are the conditions under which evidence gets taken up. There are libraries of evidence on this stuff now, and it's sort of interesting understanding the political processes, which I think DFID and others can help us with, of how things get taken up. So with that, you can continue the discussion over lunch. And thank you all so much for coming, and to all of the speakers for great presentations. Thank you.